Welcome once again. This is Pinnacle Professional College, and today we'll be bringing you a lecture on strategic case study. We'll be going through the entire ICA syllabus, and then we would go from chapter to chapter and understand, what the entire syllabus is about. So today we'll be starting with strategy, stakeholders, and mission. Strategy, stakeholders, and mission. So let's begin. Under strategy, stakeholders, and mission, we would explain the meaning of strategy and what the levels of strategy are, right? Very, very important. And number two, we'll be talking about strategic management and business analysis. So there's a slight difference between strategy and strategic management. And we also need to understand what business analysis is. When we say business analysis, what exactly do we mean? Then we know that organizations have a purpose, right? All organizations have a purpose. So we'll be studying organizational purpose and strategy. And then we'll be looking into stakeholder and stakeholder expectations. Stakeholders are basically those who are influenced or affected by the strategy of the organization. And then we'll bring everything together and try to summarize what the chapter is about. So please stick and stay with me. So first off, we need to understand a couple of things. It's very, very important. We need to understand a couple of things. What is strategy? When we say strategy, what is strategy? There's no need to memorize the definition of head, but I want to give you an understanding of exactly, what it means, right? What it means. So when we say strategy, strategy is basically long-term thinking. Long-term thinking. So when you talk about strategy, you are looking at the long-term approach of an organization in achieving its objectives, right? And once the organization has this long-term thinking, they put in place plans and courses of action to achieve these objectives, right? So one, there's a long-term thinking. So the organization is looking far into the future to, to do this, like in 10 years, in 20 years. That's when the organization is looking into. And then they put in place what we call courses of action, plans, workable plans to achieve those objectives. Now, as you may be aware, these two things that we've mentioned are not enough to achieve a strategy, right? So number one, you have what? Long-term thinking or long-term goals. Number two, you have courses of action, right? And number three, you need resources to be able to fulfill these plans, right? So the organization would have a long-term goal, will put in place courses of action to achieve this goal, and then would have the requisite resources for carrying out these goals. So anytime you think about strategy, you're thinking about three things here. Number one key word shall come to your mind. Number one is what? Long-term. Long-term. Number two is what? Course of action or plans. Number three is what? Resources. So these three things come together to form what we call a strategy. Very, very important. We are told here that strategy is the determination of the basic long-term goals and objectives of an enterprise and the adoption of courses of action and the allocation of resources necessary for carrying out these goals. So very simple definition, and it encompasses the three things that we mentioned, which is long-term, courses of action, and resources. Now let's talk about business analysis. When we say business analysis, what do we mean? Now, again, we do not need to memorize. Let's understand it first. When we say business analysis, we are simply talking about the business in the context of its environment, right? So every business would have an environment, would have other businesses that it operates with in a particular industry, in a particular sphere, right? Now, when we are doing business analysis, we are trying to understand the position of that entity in tandem with other entities within that space or within that environment. Very, very key. So when we are analyzing a business, we are looking at what is the position of the entity within its external environment. What is the position of the entity within its external environment, right? Very, very important. Very, very important. And once again, to understand business analysis, you need to understand three key phrases or words. Number one is position. Number two is, which we've talked about, right? We are trying to understand the position of the entity within its environment. And number two is the choices of the entity. What kind of decisions does this entity make? What are some of the decisions that the entity makes? You know, and number three is the strategies. The strategies that it implements, right? So you are looking at position, you are looking at decision, and you are looking at implementation. So number one, when we talk about business analysis, you are talking about what's the position of the entity, what are the strategic decisions they are making, and how do they go about implementing them. So that's business analysis, right? Again, business analysis is looking at the position of the entity within the context of its environment. So business analysis, as defined here, is basically about the strategic position of an entity, making strategic choices and putting those chosen strategies into action. So position, decision, implementation. Keep that in mind, please. Now, what is strategic management? Strategic management. Strategic management combines two keywords, strategic and management. We already know what strategy is, right? So if we understand what management is, we can sort of explain this, right? So strategic management is basically the management process that is involved in the formulation and implementation of a strategy, right? But when you look at strategic management, it involves some questions. You ask questions. Strategic questions will trigger the whole strategic process. So what businesses should we be in, for instance? What kind of businesses are we supposed to be in as a company? And how are we going to gain competitive advantage, right? So before you embark on any business, you ask yourself first, like, what kind of business would make sense for me to embark on? And will this kind of business give me an edge over my competitors? Now, Peter Drucker is one of the foremost thinkers when it comes to strategy. So his definition might throw more light on what I initially discussed. All right, so Peter Drucker says strategy is basically a pattern of activities that seeks to achieve the objectives of the organization and adapts its scope, resources, and operations to environmental changes in the long term. Right? So the three things we mentioned, long-term, resources, courses of action, we see all of them in Peter's or Drucker's definition. So you can see resources, that you can see long-term, and you can see pattern of activities, which are basically courses of action, right? So basically, a strategy will consist of organized activities or organized courses of action. These courses of action would help to achieve an objective. Strategy is long-term, as we've already indicated, and strategic decisions have to be made to achieve those objectives. Very, very important. Very, very important. So how would a company's strategic 5-year plan look like? And again, 5 years long-term. 5 years long-term. So what are some of the questions that they'll be asking themselves? This is very crucial. They'll be asking themselves as an individual, think about yourself and questions you ask yourself. Where am I now? So the company will be asking themselves, where are we now? Where do we want to be in 5 years' time? Where do we see ourselves going in 5 years' time? And how do we want to get there? How large will the company be? What will it be doing? Where will it be operating? How many employees will it have? Now, these questions, to remember these questions, I have an approach that I use. I call it the 4 or 5 W's and 1 H. So the W's are basically who, what, where, when. Who, what, where, and when, right? And then the H is how. Who, what, where, and when, and the H is how. So who, who would we like to serve? Who would we like to use our products to impact? So what will be our audience, right? So that's who. Then you have where, where do we want to be in 5 years' time? That's a typical example. Then you have what. What will the company be doing? Then you have when. When will the company like to achieve a particular objective? Then how, how many employees does the company want? How large does the company want to be? So always remember the 4 W's and 1 H. Now, we have another definition of strategy, but I wouldn't want to go too much into it because we've talked a lot about it. Please take the time to read these definitions as you may want to. So Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington identified the range or scope of strategic decision as follows. All right, you have, so these 3 folks, Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington, they looked at the scope of strategic decisions and how it unfolds. So you have deciding the scope of the entity's activities. What kind of business should we be in, which we already discussed. Relating those activities to the environment it operates in, ensuring that the entity has the resource capability, then allocating those resources. So these are things we've already talked about, except for the fact that it's being explained in more detail by Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. So let's move on to other things. Now, we see here the definition of strategic management. Strategic management. So strategic management is concerned with the identification, selection, and implementation of strategies. Right? So 3 key words here. Strategic management will begin with identifying a strategy, right? Or identifying possible strategies, I should say. Then selecting the best strategy and then implementing it. Strategic management basically creates a framework. It creates a framework for the long-term success of the company. It creates a framework for the long-term success of the company. So when we talk about strategic management, we are looking at how the organization would achieve its objectives and obtain the best possible results. How the organization would achieve its objectives and obtain the best possible results. Very, very important. So that's strategic management. So strategic management slightly differs from strategic planning, long-term planning, and corporate planning. And I'll explain, because this can be quite confusing. Right? So strategic management, as we already explained, is about identifying possible strategy, selecting the best alternative, and implementing it to achieve the long-term goals of the organization. However, strategic planning is more about preparing a plan. As the name indicates, it's about planning. So it's about preparing a plan for achieving the strategic goals that have been set. All right. So when we talk about strategic planning, we are looking at the planning process involved on how to achieve the strategic objectives. Right. Remember, we talked about courses of action and workable plans when we are defining strategy. So strategic planning looks at preparing plans to achieve those objectives. It's very, very important. So the difference here is that whereas strategic planning is more concerned with making planning decisions, strategic management is concerned with making implementations, right? Strategic planning is focused on making very good planning decisions. Strategic management is focused on making very good implementation decisions. Very crucial. Then when we talk about long-term planning, as the name suggests, when we say long-term planning is basically making plans for the long term, right? Making plans for the long term. So you could have a long-term plan for an individual department, for instance. You could have a long-term plan like that. But when we talk about strategic management, it's basically looks at the entire organization, the organization in its entirety, or the whole organization. Very, very important. Very, very important. When you look at long-term planning, we are talking about making plans for the long-term success of the organizations. The key difference here is that for long-term planning, it may be done for an individual department. But when we usually talk about strategic management, we are looking at the organization in its entirety. Now, what is corporate planning? What is corporate planning? Corporate planning, when you hear the word corporate, it simply means company. So corporate planning is simply planning for an entire company. Right? Very, very important. So the only difference here is that in terms of hierarchy, strategic planning and strategic management come above corporate planning. So corporate planning, in other words, would be a step below strategic management and strategic planning, right? So for instance, a company would have like a strategy to expand the operations into, let's say, expand the operations into China, for instance, right? And the corporate plan, which is a level below strategic management and strategic planning, will set a plan to see how they can put together a plant, right? A production plant to be able to produce the products they want to in China, right? So when we talk about strategy, and we talk about plans, you can see here that plans are more workable. They break the strategy down into workable plans, right? Action points that the organization can go ahead and implement. So that's corporate planning. Corporate planning is simply planning for the company. After the strategy has been set, you need plans, action points that the organization can work on. Now, let's look at levels of strategy. Levels of strategy, very important. So when you look at levels of strategy, you're looking at three things. You have corporate strategy, you have business strategy, and you have functional strategy. You have corporate, business, and functional strategy. These are three levels of strategy. Now, what is corporate strategy? What is corporate strategy? Now, the names give it away, and that's why it's important to understand it rather than just memorize. So corporate strategy, it looks mainly at what kind of businesses that should the company be in? What kind of businesses should the company be in? Now, when you look at business strategy, we are looking at competition. How should we compete? Remember when we talked about business analysis, if you've forgotten, we talked about the fact that business analysis looks at the position of the company in the external environment. So that's looking at, in a sense, it's looking at competition, because in the external environment, or in the environment of the company, there will be other companies that are competing against it or competing with it, right? So when we look at business strategy, we are looking at how we should compete in each selected business. How should we compete with other people? So for example, how should Microsoft compete with Google? How should Apple compete with Samsung? That's what business strategy is all about. Now you have functional strategy, right? Some people say function, some people say department, etc. But the technical word is function, because they perform a particular function. That's the whole idea of functional strategy. So functional strategy is basically looking at, for each of the business functions within the company, how can they contribute to the competitive advantage of the company? What is the contribution of each of the parts of the organization to the whole agenda? So what's the contribution of, let's say, the marketing function to the overall strategy of MTN, to the overall strategy of strategy of, let's say, let's say Airtel, So we are looking at functional strategy. That's what we mean by functional strategy. So if you realize, corporate strategy is at the apex, at the top, and then it flows down and down to function. So corporate strategy is top level. You're looking at top level. Remember, I said corporate is like company. So it's like the company strategy, and then whatever the company decides on, then it feeds down to the functions. Now, one of the things I should note here is that the strategies in this hierarchy should be consistent with each other. The strategies should be consistent with each other. Why is this necessary? Because you do not want confusion in the implementation. So the corporate strategies will seek to achieve the overall objective of the entity. And then each business strategy should have its own objective, right? And the achievement of the business strategy should contribute to the achievement of the corporate strategy. Remember, this is a hierarchy. Same for functional strategy. Functional strategy should have its own objective, and achieving the functional strategy must contribute to the achievement of the business strategy. right? So you have corporate strategy at the top, business strategy below, and then functional strategy. It's very, very crucial. Now, let's explain into more detail what we mean by these three levels, right? As I already mentioned, corporate strategy is concerned with basically deciding what kind of businesses we want to be in as a company and our overall targets. So typical elements of corporate strategy would be, what is our overall purpose as an organization? What is our overall purpose? Why are we here as an organization? And then another part of corporate strategy will be to decide the scope of the activities. Decide the scope of activities. What kind of activities would we like to involve ourselves in as a company? Right. So if you are a transportation company, or if we are, let's say if you are a telecommunication company, do we want to also make phones as part of our endeavors, right? Or we just want to provide a network to our customers? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves. What is the scope of our activities, right? Then another thing that we look at when it comes to corporate strategies, we take those chosen business activities and match them to the external environment. You take those business activities and match them to external environments and also to the resources that are available. So what does this mean, right? Whatever you choose as the activities you want to perform, you'd have to find people within the external environment who would be willing to buy. You'd have to find customers. You are not creating it for fun or just as a hobby. You need to match those activities with the external environment. And you need to also find resources internally and externally to fulfill the continual performance of those activities. Very, very important. Now, let's look at corporate strategy and the expectations of owners and stakeholders. Now, if you have any questions, you can just comment below on this channel and then I'll respond to it. So when you look at corporate strategy and the expectations of owners and other stakeholders, you would realize that owners would have their expectations. Everybody has their own expectations when it comes to the company. And then stakeholders too, other stakeholders would have their expectations. So who are the owners? First of all, the owners are those people who have invested their hard-earned money into the company. So these are the shareholders, right? So the expectation will be that they would get a yield on their investments and that the company will grow, right? So basically, it's about maximization of shareholder wealth, right? And then there are other stakeholders. As I already mentioned, a stakeholder is simply someone who is affected or influenced by the strategy of the organization, or basically has an interest in the organization and what it does. So there are different kinds of stakeholders. You have customers, you have suppliers, you have tax authorities, you have the government, you have lenders, employees, etc. All these people have they have their own interest in the organization. Now, again, we've talked about corporate strategy. We've seen how corporate strategy is basically strategy for the entire organization on how to achieve its overall targets. When you talk about corporate strategy, you're looking at deciding the overall purpose of the organization, what are the scope of activities that they will be engaged in, and then match those activities to the external environment and to the resources available. Now, when we talk about business strategy, it's also competitive strategy. We kind of like discussed this earlier, right? In business strategy, you're looking at how all of the business activities contribute towards the achievement of the corporate strategy. Every company has business activities, and we are keen on seeing how these contribute to the overall strategy of the organization. Very, very important. Right. So when we talk about a business strategy, it basically consists of two things. You have cost leadership or differentiation. Very, very important. Very, very important. Right. So you have cost leadership and you have differentiation. So what is cost leadership? Cost leadership is basically becoming the most efficient when it comes to production costs in the market. So you are leading as an organization by being the lowest cost producer. So you produce the cheapest in the market. Just like there were some Chinese products that were very, very cheap that were dumped on the Ghanaian market, and basically took out a lot of Ghanaian products. So cost leadership is basically becoming the lowest cost producer in the market, a company that can make products or provide services at a lower cost than competitors will succeed, right? Because depending on the product, people will gravitate towards cheap, right? So becoming the lowest cost producer. Then you have differentiation. Now, when we say differentiation, the word differentiation means to stand out, right? To be different. So it basically means making products or services that are different from the competitors, right? So this is not about producing at a very low cost, right? This is not about producing at a very low cost. This is making your product unique, that it stands out from your competitors. A typical product is here that follows differentiation is Apple, right? Apple is unique. Even though it's expensive, people still buy it because it has certain functions and certain attributes, and it comes with a certain prestige that people want to be associated with it. Right, now let's move on to functional strategy. So functional strategy basically talks about the different functions within the organization. So you have marketing, accounting, manufacturing, research, etc. Right? So what are the strategies that this function has, and how does it contribute to the business strategy and the corporate strategy of the organization? Very, very crucial. Very, very crucial. Now, let's delve into this because I think this is very, very important. Let's look at the levels of planning. We've talked about levels of strategy. Let's look at the levels of planning. We have seen that strategy is a hierarchy of corporate strategy, business strategy, and functional strategy, right? That's what we've seen. But planning also has levels. Now we have strategic planning, we have tactical planning, and we have operational planning. Right? When we talk about strategic planning, we are looking at plans that have been set for achieving the objectives of the company, which are long-term. Right? So these are long-term plans, basically, for the entire organization. And when we talk about tactical planning, these are shorter-term plans for achieving medium-term objectives, right? So strategic plans, you have long-term plans for achieving long-term objectives. Tactical planning, we are looking at shorter-term plans or medium-term plans for achieving medium-term objectives. Then operational planning, here we are looking at very short-term plans for achieving short-term objectives. And these are more detailed. These are more detailed and they occur at the junior management level. So let me take this again so that you clearly understand it. So when we look at strategic planning, this happens at the top hierarchy of the organization. These are long-term plans for achieving long-term objectives, right? And that's what it is about. And then when you look at tactical planning, you're looking at medium-term plans for achieving medium-term objectives. And it happens in the middle hierarchy of the organization. When you look at operational planning, it happens at the junior level of the organization and for the achievement of short-term goals. So one is long-term, one is medium-term, and the other is short-term, respectively. So what's an example of a strategic plan? It will be like a 5-year plan. What's an example of a tactical plan? It will be like an annual plan, which is an annual budget. What's an example of an operational plan? It will be a daily plan. So this is how to differentiate these 3 levels of planning. Now let's talk about the approaches to strategic planning. What are the approaches to strategic planning? Within the strategic management process, there will be some planning. Now, there are different approaches to this. Number 1, you have the rational planning model. The rational model, right? So the rational model is the same as the top-down approach to strategic planning, right? So what does it mean when we say top-down? It means that the plans are prepared at senior management level, and then it trickles down, right? It trickles down. So that's why we call it a top-down approach, It is called rational. It's called rational because it's a logical planning process. It is not random. It's very, very logical, right? And what is the process that it goes through? The process begins with analysis, analyzing the position of the company, making choices, and then implementing those choices and evaluating, right? So the acronym here would be ACCE, sort of ACE, kind of. So the reason why it's logical and rational is it follows a process. You have analysis, you have choices, you have implementation, and evaluating what you've implemented. Right? So that's the rational planning model. First off, you need to know that it's top-down. It starts at the senior management. And secondly, it's very, very rational. It's very, very rational. Then you also have the logical incremental model. The logical incremental model. Now, what's this all about? We've already talked about the logical model. So what's logical incremental? Now, I'm sure you might be having an idea. So this view of strategic planning is that effective strategies emerge as a series of strategies for subsystems within the organization, one at a time and not as part of an overall coordinated plan, right? So logical incremental model also has a logical basis, a logical foundation, but new strategies are implemented in increments, right? It follows the rational process, but then it implements these new strategies in increments. So that's why we have logical and incremental. So when we say logical, it follows a process. When we say incremental, it basically means that the new strategies are devised and implemented in increments, Very, very important. And we said that the rational process is what? ACE or ACIE, which is analysis, choices, implementation, and evaluation. Now let's look at the freewheeling opportunism model. Freewheeling opportunism model is like basically what we call freestyling. There is no rational, there's no formal strategic planning process. An organization is basically open to seeing new opportunities as they arise and taking advantage of them, right? The organization, however, will have a general idea of where they are going, but they are not fixated on formal plans. They just know where they are going and they freewheel and take advantage of opportunities, right? So this is where we would bring today's lecture to an end. If you have any questions on this lecture, don't hesitate to leave a comment and I'll respond to the comments. Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.